Hello, in just a moment, the press preview as we take a look at the morning's papers. But first, our top stories. The fiancé of the children's author Helen Bailey has been found guilty of murdering her in a plot to steal her money. Cressida Dick has become the first woman to take charge of the Metropolitan Police after being named as the new commissioner at Scotland Yard. And the family of a British jihadi say they still haven't received any confirmation from the authorities about the circumstances of his death. Hello there, you're watching Sky News and the press preview. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Elizabeth Day and the Times columnist Matthew Parris. But first, let's have a look at the front pages. And the Eye says that the appointment of Cressida Dick as the new Met Police Commissioner has faced criticism. That appointment is also the lead story in The Guardian. The Metro reports on the conviction of Ian Stewart, who murdered his fiancée Helen Bailey, saying police are re-examining the death of his first wife. The Sun also leads on that story. The Telegraph says the government is under pressure to prove that compensation paid to British terror suspects held at Guantanamo Bay didn't end up with the so-called Islamic State. The Daily Mail says the RAF has been targeting British jihadists with drone strikes. The Times leads on a new report which suggests that British power stations that burn American wood pellets produce more greenhouse gases than coal plants. Unilever says it will conduct a thorough review of its business to boost profits, that's according to the FT. The Express says a new jab could help prevent the development of type 2 diabetes. The Star leads with Katy Perry's performance at the Brit Awards, and the Mirror has a story about a lottery winner. Well, I'm joined by the journalist and author Elizabeth Day and the Times columnist Matthew Parris. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's start with this story in the Telegraph. And did the UK terror payouts go out to ISIL? And of course, this is really the story of the day, isn't it? Whether this £1 million that was paid as a compensation to Jamal al-Harith, if it ended up in ISIL's hands.
Yes, the Telegraph is broadening out the story a bit here because, as we know, Jamal al-Harith received up to £1 million of UK taxpayers' money after he was released from Guantanamo Bay, the argument being at the time that he was erroneously incarcerated there. And then he went and blew himself up in Iraq in a suicide bomb attack. And the Telegraph is now asking the broader question as to whether the other British detainees released from Guantanamo Bay who also received compensation, whether those funds might eventually have been linked to Islamic State terror groups. And I think they're saying here that it has emerged that 4 of the 17 British detainees thought to have been given compensation have been accused of these kind of links, and one of the men went on a trip with so-called Jihadi John, the hostage killer. So some serious questions to be asked here about what happened to the compensation, whether there was careful enough monitoring of these people who had suspected terrorist links, and whether the compensation was in fact given as a kind of hush money so that embarrassing details about rendition and torture wouldn't emerge and embarrass the UK government further.
Yes, you're quite right, serious question marks, but you see in the headline there is a question mark, and none of this has really been entirely determined yet. It's perfectly possible that all the compensation payments were quite fairly paid to people who are entirely deserving of the compensation payments. And I agree with you that the bigger story is the second one, the question of whether everybody, all those people, were monitored as they probably should have been, because there had been questions over their activities.
Well, it all unfortunately comes down to cost, doesn't it, really? Because to monitor someone, in this instance of Fidley, it would have been 10 years. They would have had to have people on him. And I think it's up to between 30 or 40 officers per person. I mean, you just can't afford that, can you?
Well, but they are doing a lot of monitoring all the time, as they should. And I would have thought that people who had been in Guantanamo Bay were probably people you would just want to make quite sure
just keep tabs on.
That they were okay.
I mean, I think what mustn't be lost here is that our intelligence services are extremely effective, aren't they?
Absolutely so. And the second part of the story, which again you mentioned, that the question of whether it was, and it was not the Blair government, it now seems, but the coalition government that paid quite a lot of this money out. Whether that was because they didn't want it to go to court, because if it had gone to court, the government would have had to reveal its sources and how the information had been found, and that might have compromised our security operations. That's perfectly possible, but it might have been the right thing for the government to do. We don't want to compromise our security operations.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to this other story, the other story of the day, really, and that is of Cressida Dick being named as the chief of the Met Police. Astonishing, really, that in 2017 we have the first chief of the Met Police. It was started in 1829. It's taken a bit of time.
Yeah, I wish I was better at maths and I could work out exactly how long it's been. But yes, it's wonderful news, and I think she was clearly the strongest candidate through a very rigorous interview process. And the reason I'm particularly happy about it is because it means that at the top of crime and policing initiatives, we now have a number of senior women in a job that historically has been seen as a predominantly male career. So we have Cressida Dick, and we have the head of the National Crime Agency and the head of the Chief Constables Association, and of course Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, all of whom are women. So I'm very, very pro this appointment, and I think Cressida Dick gave a lovely statement earlier about how thrilled she was to be taking on the role.
It's certainly, on the face of it, a good news story, and, well, I'm a journalist, so I have to admit that this is what journalists do, but I'm afraid what we have done is go straight to the family of Jean-Charles de Menezes, and she was at the helm, as people say, when that, as we now know, completely unjustifiable killing took place. But at the helm doesn't mean that it was her fault, and so far as I remember from reports at the time, no one is suggesting that it was.
She also hasn't actually led a police force. I mean, do you think that could be a bit of a problem coming into that job?
Might be an advantage.
Yes.
Why do you think it could be an advantage?
Well, I think that because her predecessor, Bernard Hogan Howe, I think was respected, but I think it was rumoured that he had a somewhat abrasive style, and I think that Cressida Dick has less of an abrasive style, and possibly having worked in that environment and having seen under Bernard Hogan Howe, because she was his assistant commissioner for a while, wasn't she? I think she's a Met person through and through, and she probably knows all the problems just from having worked there. So I actually think, as you say, it might be an advantage that she doesn't have a history of these big top male jobs. Yes,
because some big top males tend to slip into the habits of other big top males, and perhaps this is a bit of a clean break. And I think the Met's in need of a bit of a clean break. They've not had a very good few years.
No, indeed. And it's interesting you mentioned her statement. I thought it was lovely too.
Yes.
And throughout all, everything written about her, you get a sense of her ethics, a very strong sense of ethics. So perhaps that exactly is what the Met needs.
And it was one of the first times I'd actually heard her speak, because I've read a lot about her and I've heard a lot said about her, but her statements just seemed so genuine and sincere. It was delightful.
Yeah. Well, there's a little fan club for her here.
Yes,
anyway.
Go Cressida.
Next time I get a speeding ticket, I'll mention
Yes, good plan.
I wonder how she's going to do with the finances, because that's really where some of the major issues with the Met actually stand, don't they?
Yes, I mean, that's something that every person who's head of any major, partly government-funded body has to tackle. She's got many issues. She's got the monetary issue. She's got the shortage of firearms officers, because I was reading today that potential firearms officers are put off because there's been so much bad press, often quite reasonably, because some of our police officers in the past have been accused of being trigger-happy. So it's not an easy role, by all means, but today, I'm just going to put that to one side and be thankful that we've got a woman in a top position. We might not have a female president of America, but at least we have a head of the Metropolitan Police.
I think the money issue is going to chafe. After all, the present Prime Minister was Home Secretary when the number of police officers was cut, and it appears that that crime also fell at the same time. So you don't pull the wool over Mrs May's eyes on this. I think she takes not a hostile, but I think quite a cool view of policing, and I don't think there's going to be a lot more money coming the Met's way, however much they may be squealing at the moment.
Indeed. Well, good luck to Cressida Dick as she takes on her new role. Let's move now to this story. Honestly, it's stranger than fiction.
It's the kind of traumatic, devastating story that, as you say, if you read in one of the novels that Helen Bailey had written, you would struggle to believe the plot twists. So Helen Bailey, an immensely successful best-selling novelist, was killed at Transpire today. He was convicted of her murder by her fiancé, Stuart Bailey, who over a period of weeks had been drugging her with sleeping tablets and then smothered her and buried her remains in a cesspit underneath the garage of their house with her pet Dachshund, Boris. We were talking earlier in the green room about how horrifying it is that you can be in love with someone and they can be so callous and manipulative and devoid of all human empathy.
And you cannot notice. Can you really live with someone and love them deeply and not notice that they're filled with cold hatred for you? It's really strange. There's a really good, it's my own paper, The Times, but I must plug it. Across 2 pages of The Times, this story is told in great and gripping, and I must say, gruesome detail.
Well, poor Miss Bailey, I mean, if she's been drugged for months, perhaps she had no sense of what reality really was.
Yes, and now they're opening an investigation into the death of his first wife. So Stuart Bailey was married before. In fact, they met online, Ian Stewart and Helen Bailey, on a Facebook group for the bereaved, because both their former spouses had died. And his first wife died very unexpectedly, and she was meant to have been very fit and active and then collapsed suddenly in her garden. And it was ruled death by an unexplained epileptic fit, but apparently a lot of her friends and family had many unanswered questions about what happened. So they're reinvestigating that death as well. I mean, it's gruesome. It really is. And my heart goes out to the family of Helen Bailey and also to Ian Stewart's 2 sons, who must be going through all sorts of conflicting emotions.
And it's obviously a minor detail compared with the death of a human being, but the dog was led to jump into the cesspit by its favourite toy being thrown into the cesspit.
An awful story.
This is, I wouldn't say up there, it's down there with some of the great Victorian murders and some of the great murders of the 20th century. It's awful, but it is gripping.
And it's fascinating as well because we have so much documentation now. So we have the recordings of the arrest and the police interview, and it is playing out like the most gruesome police procedural. It's awful.
Well, just an awful, awful story, and our sympathies go out to the poor families involved in this case. We're going to go to a quick break now, but we will be back. And still to come, Donald Trump and Theresa May as skeletons at the Brit Awards. We'll explain after the break. Welcome back to the press preview, where we're taking a look at the papers. I'm joined by the journalist and author Elizabeth Day and the Times columnist Matthew Parris. Right, well, let's have a look at this now. Quite scary, actually. Unplug death trap tumble dryers. What is going on there?
I know, death
I can
trap
get it in the
tumble
screen.
dryer sounds like
there we go.
Sounds like a droid from Star Wars, doesn't it? But yes, so more than a year ago, millions of machines sold under the Hotpoint and Whirlpool brands were declared to have faults, but Whirlpool didn't really handle it that well, and I think they just said, you can probably still keep using them if you're careful. But now we have horrific pictures like this. That is a woman called Melissa Dooley with her tumble dryer that just bursts spontaneously into flames. So they can be very dangerous machines, and Matthew and I, neither of us own one. So
we don't think people are owning tumble dryers anymore. They're very unecological for a start. They're also very expensive to operate because you're just using electricity to heat. So I wouldn't say that anyone deserves for their tumble dryer to burst into flames, but this is a warning.
No, no, we're not advocating.
It's a sort of early 90s gadget, isn't it? It's a kind of early 90s machine. Like it's it's like filofaxes and flash tumble dryers. It's just...
Came just before laundrettes, or just after laundrettes.
Yes, just after the Levi's adverts,
yes.
I must say I don't have one, although I would love one, especially given the fact that it's so cold and so difficult to dry things here. But yeah, ecologically, possibly not the best. But it's interesting here, I think what we should look at is what Whirlpool, how they reacted. If you've got dryers blowing up, surely they should immediately recall them.
It's interesting how slowly sometimes big multinationals respond to things like this, because there was the Samsung Galaxy issue as well relatively recently where their phones were bursting into flames, and then there was the car company, and I can't remember which car company it was, but they were having really serious issues, and being slow to respond turns into a PR fiasco as well as putting people's lives in danger. So you'd think they'd learn slightly more quickly.
Yes, but sometimes these things turn out to be not a fault that's replicated in other machines, and you don't want to spend billions of pounds recalling everyone's
yeah.
machine. I love the details in this story. A health and social care student, Miss Dooley, was forced to sleep temporarily on a sofa at her mother Celia's house with Thomas, that's her 3-year-old son, and teenage son Jack. I love the details.
How kind
I
of
felt so
Celia.
helpless.
Yes.
Oh.
No, but that is actually quite traumatic. We mustn't trivialise it. It must be a horrific thing to happen.
It's
But-
lucky she was there, because I imagine
Yes.
lots of people just leave their tumble dryers on and then go to work.
Could have set
no, I
fire to the
always leave
house.
the machine on, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to something slightly lighter, shall we say, and that is YouTube to blame for falling reading skills? What's going on here?
Yes.
It's
you
the
go,
social
Matthew.
media again, isn't it? That the language used on the social media tends to be fairly simple, and also that new books, for instance, well, they say the Harry Potter books use a rather small vocabulary. I mean, people have always said this. When I was a little boy, Mum tried to stop us reading Enid Blyton because she said the vocabulary was rather small and we shouldn't read the famous 5 and we shouldn't read the secret 7.
What does she tell you should read?
Wind in the Willows. But I like Wind in the Willows now, but I wasn't interested in Rat and Moley and things like that. I was more interested in the secret 7 in a cave.
Yes.
I think there's always this fear that the children are turning to the easier stuff, but the easier stuff leads you on to more difficult stuff. What do you think?
I think, well, it's interesting because they're saying that, I think the problem here is that the books are so good, so Harry Potter is so good that people don't want to move on to, quote unquote, the next level of reading. And the Daily Mail is rather dismissive here of J.K. Rowling and accuses her of using basic language. And I can't help but suspect that that has something to do with the J.K. Rowling-Piers Morgan Twitter spat, because Piers Morgan obviously is a columnist for the Mail Group, and he's got into a Twitter spat recently with J.K. Rowling because of her anti-Donald Trump tweets. I mean, I feel like the Harry Potter books have done an immense amount for getting young children to read actual physical paper copies of books, and that is to be applauded. I have to confess I'm not a massive fan of YouTube stars, but again, they sell by the bucket load actual books. Again, they have these very successful YouTube channels, people like Zoella, but then they
So
sell
how
books
does
as well.
how does her YouTube channel work? She has a book club, I'm assuming.
I mean, don't ask me. No, she has, I believe that she has a channel and people subscribe to it, and she gives beauty and makeup tips, lifestyle tips, and that is how you build up your ready-made sort of readership network, and then you publish a book or an autobiography at the age of 12, and millions of people buy it.
But plus ça change. When I was a child, it was comics. The adults didn't want us to read comics because we just liked looking at the pictures, and I loved Dan Dare and the Mekon and the Beano and the Dandy and all that kind of thing.
I was a member of the Desperate Dan fan club.
Oh, I loved Beryl the Peril. Do you remember in her
Got to
striking...
get to the weather.
Yes.
Got to get to the weather.
So well.
Honestly, I would have been straight if I'd ever met a Beryl the Peril in real life.
Oh my God,
Would have
that was
turned
the best
me.
line ever.
And on that, we're going to have a quick look at the weather. Thank you so much for joining us.